Slave Zero is a bombastic romp of rampaging robots and urban destruction set within a cyberpunk universe slathered in neon and oozing techno music. A relic of the 90s that encapsulates everything extreme and ridiculous of the era. Slave Zero has fallen into relative obscurity since its release 20 years ago, but a contingency of fans and publishers have kept the game available and working on modern platforms. And since I had never heard of the game before the making of this video, I figured this would be an interesting piece to dust off and dive into. Hey everybody, I'm Kirk, and in today's video I'll be taking a look at Slave Zero to see if it's a hidden gem you need or another hunk of junk ready for the scrap pile. But before all that, please remember to subscribe to this channel for more retro gaming goodness. Alright, let's begin. Slave Zero was originally developed and published by Infogrames, remember them? And released in 1999 for the Dreamcast and PC. While its release wasn't earth-shattering, it did manage to garner enough of a following for fans to keep the game updated and running on current operating systems. This eventually resulted in the game publishers Tomo and Night Dive Studios helping to get the game released on digital platforms in the mid-2010s. The game is currently owned by Ziggurat Interactive, who made news not too long ago when they acquired the Blood Rain franchise, and the publisher was kind enough to provide me with a code for the game, along with a few other old school classics I'll be taking a look at in the future. Set 500 years in the future, Slave Zero is a third-person shooter with platforming elements. It's a game with a whole lot of shooting, a whole lot of jumping, complemented with hardcore late 90s style.
Well, Captain, have you anything to add?
The Earth is ruled by the all-powerful, all-evil Sovkhan. The Sovkhan rules with a pasty iron fist from the massive megacity S19, a bleak urban sprawl that could give Blade Runner a run for its money. The Sovkhan commands a nearly invincible army of tanks, planes, mechs, and most importantly, the 60-foot-tall humanoid robots known as slaves. Desperate to dethrone this comfy king, a small resistance force has stolen a prototype slave, known as Slave Zero, to combat the Khan's forces. You play as Chan, an agent of the resistance whose mind has been interfaced with Slave Zero's. Chan's mission? Fight his way to the top of the megacity and defeat the Sovkhan once and for all. An elegant way I could describe Slave Zero is that it's very much a video game-ass video game. The plot is there as an adequate explanation for why you need to be blowing stuff up for the next 6 hours, with each level a dire call to action. It's certainly in the John Carmack school of thought for video game narratives. I don't really consider this a negative though. This is a product of its time, an arcadey shooter that's meant to get the player's heart beating, not to give them any real food for thought. The game clearly wears its influences on its cybernetic sleeves. This game bleeds 80s and 90s anime. Megacity itself brings classics like Akira and Ghost in the Shell to mind, and the slave units are pretty blatant ripoffs of Evangelions. Oh, and the cherry topper, having your wise old sensei give you support telepathically. Because why not?
Feel the power of the slave under your will.
Yeah, it's pretty derivative, but I don't think I'd want it any other way. Playing Slave Zero today, you can't help but feel like you've opened a time capsule. This is a style of game you saw a lot of in the late 90s, and today it holds a certain nostalgic charm. And you know what? It's not a bad looking game either despite its age. The environments are kind of on the busy side, but are effective at creating a stark, dark, cyberpunky vibe that was popular then and is having a resurgence now. Plus your slave unit is pretty well animated. He's got this smooth flow to his movements while also brimming with destructive robot energy. Plus look at those fingers. Ooh, they're cool and weird looking.
Good job, Slave Zero. Now all we have to do is get your sorry ass out of there as well.
And of course, complementing all of this is the game's rollicking soundtrack, a cascade of industrial rock and techno that is very much the definition of the 90s zeitgeist. And I gotta say, I was digging it. There was plenty of head bopping during my gameplay sessions, and these hard guitar riffs are still stuck in my head. Gameplay-wise, Slave Zero is pretty straightforward, but solid, with some questionable choices. The game is simple. Go from level to level, shooting your way through an army of robots while completing a set of objectives, usually involving blowing something up or protecting something. There's not much to it, and the game can get a little repetitive. Seeing as I finished it in around 6 to 7 hours, I'd say it was on the cusp of overstaying its welcome. Controlling Slave Zero feels really good. This Rockin' Robo is very responsive and glides effortlessly around the environment. The smooth animations complement the smooth controls. The platforming isn't too bad either. In fact, the mantling in this game is really well done and pretty sophisticated compared to other games of the time with similar mechanics. And you gotta love Slave Zero's roaring foot stomp, which can obliterate the smaller vehicular enemies. You can also pick up objects and vehicles to throw at your enemies. In fact, as I discovered here, you can pick up people and throw them. Yeah, I was having far too much fun picking up these poor little pedestrians and splatting them on the wall. Has 25 years of gaming turned me into a psychopath? Maybe. I am a little surprised though this game doesn't have a dash mechanic for dodging. It would have come in handy for some of the later projectile heavy enemies. The shooting also feels fairly good and responsive, minus one glaring issue that I'll touch on in a second. But if it's one thing I wish was improved, it's your enemy's response to getting shot. There's not much of a reaction here, and when they die, they just sort of slump over and blow up. It would have been nice to see little bits of twisted metal and debris flying off of these guys as you shoot them, just to give the shooting a little more impact. Now, my one big issue with the shooting mechanics here is the fact that the crosshair is actually off. Check this out, see where the damage decals are hitting on the wall? Your shots are actually hitting the upper left of the crosshair, not directly in the center like it should be. Now, it's not hard to compensate for this, and in fact, most of your fights are in close quarters, so it's not the biggest issue in the world, but trying to kill enemies with a long-range weapon can be a little frustrating. Looking into it, from what I can tell, this is a bug that was introduced when the game was updated for the GOG and Steam release, and there is a way to fix it. But the fact still remains, this is likely an issue you will have to deal with if you choose to purchase the game. There are 3 weapon types in the game, a machine gun, an energy gun, and a shoulder-mounted rocket launcher. As you go through the game, you can find upgrades, which are essentially different weapons. For example, you start out with the basic machine gun, and then eventually find the better assault cannon, and then the Gatling-like cyclone cannon, eventually ending on the slow-firing explosive siege cannon. For the energy weapons, you can upgrade to the shotgun-like burst gun, a railgun, a plasma beam, and then the BFG-like dark matter weapon. And the shoulder rockets have a myriad of upgrades as well, ranging from homing rockets to scatter rockets. The upgrades aren't permanent though. If you can find the pickups, you have the option to downgrade the weapons to their previous types. Yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of this system. For starters, I don't like how they are referred to as upgrades and downgrades. It's a little misleading. For example, the energy burst gun upgrades to a railgun, but whether or not the railgun is better than the burst gun really depends on the combat situation you're in. Same with the cyclone cannon going to the siege cannon. Either one might be totally useless depending on the situation. I know that's picky, but I just found it odd. If we disregard the terminology, the system is not that much different from the one Halo would popularize in a few short years. On paper, limiting the player's weapons can be a good way to add a layer of strategy to the game. The problem is, weapon pickups are not super common, and there's a good chance you're going to get stuck with a weapon in a level where it's not super effective. Now, before I continue on the weapons, I need to touch on the ammo situation. Ammo in Slave Zero is weirdly scarce. You know what weapon I use the most in this game? The shoulder-mounted rockets. You know why? Because I was always running out of ammo with my primary weapons, and for whatever reason, there are just more rocket pickups in the world than bullets or energy. It's not like the rockets are bad, quite the contrary. Early in the game, they can kill most enemies in 1 or 2 shots. It's just kind of backwards. You'd think they'd make the rockets far more scarce than the ammo. Now, maybe you could argue that ammo conservation is a pillar of this game, which is a good point. But here's the thing that brings us back full circle. The strongest upgrades absolutely burn through ammo, like a hot knife through butter. And if you happen to be stuck on a level with no weapon pickups and have a loadout of the top upgrades, ammo quickly becomes a precious commodity, and you'll find yourself relying on your rockets more. And unfortunately, the rockets become far less effective in the late game. What would have been better is to allow the player to equip any of the weapons at any time, but be limited by the 2 ammo pools. That way the player still has to be mindful about what weapons to use, but not be at the mercy of the specific pickups in any given level. All in all though, I think my favorite aspect of the game are the boss fights. The second boss fight is a highlight for me. You fight this giant Power Rangers looking guy while trying to outrun the green goo flooding the environment. It's an intense fight with the only drawback being how easy it is to get caught on the level geometry. And then the third boss fight is against these two snake looking robos on the city rooftops. These guys are pretty tricky to hit, and as the fight progresses, they destroy each of the buildings one by one, limiting your mobility. It's not mind-blowing design, but it is executed well. Now, while I generally found Slave Zero to be enjoyable, I ran into a couple big issues that I think really hold the game back. While Slave Zero runs on a modern operating system proficiently, in between firefights I ran into a lot of severe hitching, sometimes to the point where it was really hampering the gameplay experience. My assumption is that this is being caused by level geometry loading in the background, as, like I said, it was often in between firefights in long corridors or when going through a giant door. Classic background loading zones. Now, I'm not sure if this issue was present when the game first released, or if this is something that has cropped up from running on modern hardware. Either way, it's an issue. Otherwise, the game ran rather smoothly. Until it didn't. In the last third of the game, I ran into several instances of the game crashing to the desktop, typically after doing something normal like firing a weapon or moving to a certain part of the map. And the crash would repeat in the same spot every time I rebooted the game. I was forced to reload a previous or alternate save to get past that particular point. Pretty annoying, especially since the last third of the game was trying my patience. I played Slave Zero on hard, which is usually what I do with most games, and found it to be a cakewalk, until I hit the final levels and suddenly found I was getting my ass handed to me over and over. Now, I'm not complaining that the game gets difficult. I enjoy a fair challenge in my video games, but the key word here is fair. And man, oh man, is Slave Zero a cheap bastard in the late game. The big culprit here is the level design. For the most part, Slave Zero's levels are open enough to allow you to maneuver during combat, but then when you hit these later levels, you're suddenly finding yourself in constrictive hallways and narrow freeways above death drops. And a lot of these late game enemies are massive bullet sponges with overpowered weapons that are placed in spots that are, well, cheap. Look at this moment right here. Turn the corner and, boop, blasted off the freeway to my death. Yeah, that's real fair. Far from the worst though. Here I have to jump down into this lower hallway. Let's see what happens. Yeah, that's real fun. Oh no, here's the best one. Look at this. Look at that, blasted outside the level. Ugh, didn't even have a chance. Now, you could argue that your more powerful weapons are key to getting you through these parts, and you would be correct. But remember, not a lot of ammo for these puppies. It got to the point where the best strategy was just to hide in the corners and cheese my way through these enemies, which is not much fun and a far cry from the fast, gliding combat of the early game. Now, despite how much I despise the final stretch of the game, along with the technical issues and other quirky design choices, Slave Zero at its core is a decent game. The mechanics are solid, the visuals have old school charm, the plot and atmosphere of the game are fun and goofy, the game has good bones despite some glaring issues holding it back. And when I play a title like this, I can't help but think it's a prime candidate for a remaster. Now, I have no idea how much demand there is for Slave Zero or if there's even that big of a fan base. I just feel like the issues with this game are totally fixable, and if a remaster were to happen that addressed all of them, I think there would be a new audience out there that would really appreciate how much of a 90s throwback this is. It's no masterpiece, but if you're looking for a simple, fun, arcadey game to kill an afternoon with, you could go with a lot worse than Slave Zero. That is, assuming you can tolerate the problems. However, you don't necessarily need to take my word for it. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Ziggurat was kind enough to provide me a code for the game along with 5 extra ones to give away. So if you want a chance to win a Steam key for Slave Zero, all you have to do is leave me a comment telling me what your favorite part of the 90s was. Make sure to say my favorite part of the 90s was at the beginning of the comment, so I know to count it. Easy, right? On Monday, September 21st, I'll randomly select 5 winners. And hey, if you play it and think this game deserves a fresh new coat of paint, well, then be sure to let the publisher know. Otherwise, please be sure to leave me a comment telling me what you think of the game and if you've played it before. I'm curious to find out. Real quick, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe, like, and share with your friends. It is a huge help for this channel. Looking for more high-octane robot action? Be sure to check out my review for the early access build of Ultra Kill. I post videos every Thursday, so be sure to ring that notification bell so you are the first to see them. I'm Kirk, and thank you for watching this video. Stay safe out there.